Hello, everybody. It's Michael Pierce here. Hi. Um, uh, I'm glad you guys seem to like the last two videos I did. I'm making this one because I felt like I needed to clarify a point because I think it's very important. And it's hard for me to explain. I always have a difficult time explaining it, but it has to do a little bit with the last two videos. Um, where I'd like to make a sort of a distinction. It's very important to me that I make this distinction, and I didn't make it in those videos because I don't normally talk about it because of the cultural and political climate right now. But um, excuse me, but it's something that's important to me, and I think it's also important because I don't feel like I've seen anybody who's made exactly the comments that I'd like to try to make, or some of the logical distinctions I'd like to draw. I feel that what this essentially is going to come down to is me explaining a little bit more clearly why I kept referring to it as the masculine and feminine as principles, and emphasizing that these are principles that can be treated within both men and women. Um, and so, in some sense, it's almost misleading to refer to them as masculine and feminine, but I still feel I need to do that because it fits too well into the concept of these two principles being something that need to eventually unite, and that the uniting is a creative force, and I think they are, and I'm still figuring out all the details, but what I'd like to emphasize is that notion where I'm talking about masculinity and femininity as probably the best way to put it would be to my talking about them as though they were adjectives, right? Masculine and feminine, the way I'm applying them, I applied them there as adjectives, meaning you could be more or less of them, and that there's a spectrum between the two of them. And that's not normally how I think about it. It's only been recently that I have made what I'd say a concession to that in order to help me understand and describe the psychological things I was trying to describe. It was only much more recently that I even considered making a concession in there. So let me explain what my deal is. What I have open here is a Wikipedia page. It's a way to help get the ball rolling on my thought process. And I've tried writing scripts for a video, but I've struggled, and I'm just going to try to talk it out in real time. The Wikipedia page I have open here, it's Sex Differences in Psychology, which has, I think it's been it's been an issue for the last 50, 60 years or so. But of course, me being young, it feels like it's something that has picked up steam, and really it's been picking up steam for a long, long time and has always been around. But I'm making lots of noises, see? I sound like a goat. But where should I start here? I'll just start from the beginning reading until I kind of hit where I start to have problems. Sex differences in psychology are differences in the mental functions and behaviors of the sexes, and are due to a complex interplay of biological, developmental, cultural factors. Differences have been found in a variety of fields such as mental health, cognitive abilities, personality, tendency towards aggression. Such variation can be innate and learned, blah, blah, blah. A number of factors combine to influence the developmental sex differences. So let's skip to a specific difference. For instance, personality traits. Let's go down there. Cross-cultural research has shown gender differences on the tests measuring sociability and emotionality. For example, on the scales measured by the Big Five personality traits, women consistently report higher neuroticism, agreeableness, warmth, an extroverted facet, and openness to feelings, and men often report higher assertiveness, which is a facet of extroversion and openness to ideas as assessed by the NEOPIR. I don't know what that is. I should probably study that after the video, just so I make sure I'm as up to date as possible on things. And fortunately, this is a responsible article, and they didn't have any issues at the top. Doesn't mean it doesn't have any issues at all, but anyway, I'm getting off topic. So this is a good place to start. So where I have problems is not with the information stated here, because unless the information stated here is as it turns out somehow based on bad research, we're just going to assume it's based on good research done by people with integrity, scientific integrity, and so forth, and all that stuff. And I have no problem with that. Where I get sketchy, or where it gets sketchy for me, and where I start to have problems, is the way that people often talk about this, and have been talking about it. So if you look closely, or you actually don't have to look very closely at all, I feel that when people will take this research and they'll say, okay, this, and even the way that it talks about it here, they'll extrapolate, okay, we've done this research and found that most women are this way, but they'll talk about it as though what they've really discovered is that all women are this way, or that all men are this way, when the research actually says the exact opposite. It simply says most men are this way, meaning there is a certain percentage who are not that way, and there's a certain percentage of women who are not that way. But here's where the contradiction comes in, because people are not distinguishing between, they're talking about men and women in two very different ways, or they're talking about the sex and gender in two very different ways, and they're not recognizing it. When you talk about something, you can talk about it in two different ways generally. You can talk about it, or you can talk about the concept as separate categories where there's no in between. 1, 0, it's a binary. You can be one or you can be the other. It's like electrons leaping between states of energy. There is no in between. It's either one or the other. That's a category. It's also links up with type theory, right? Where, at least in theoretical terms, it's not necessarily saying anything about reality, but in theoretical terms, you're either one or the other. And that is generally how we think about things, because it's much easier to, really, that's the only way I think we think about things in any kind of a rational scientific sense. Maybe there's mystical ways of thinking of things where you actually transcend that. But even when you think in the other way is a spectrum, right, where there is in between. In fact, there's an infinite amount of in between. So you have two poles, and it's usually on it's on a one-dimensional scale, so there's just a string between these two poles, but you could also do it as a Cartesian plane, so where it's a sheet of paper, and you can be any point on the sheet of paper, or you can even be in a cube. And that it depends on how many dimensions you want to measure something within. But the dimensions all have to be in this geometric polarity relationship with each other. But just even with the male-female thing, okay, one side is male, one side is female, and then you have a spectrum in between. And this is the argument of a lot of people. You can either talk about it that way, or you can talk about it as there being two separate categories, and you're either one or the other. And people seem to get confused, as far as I can tell, including people who talk about the sex difference research, because it seems that what they want to do is they want to talk about, I'm thinking of, for instance, Jordan Peterson in some cases, or Dr. Baron Cohen has done some research with this. I'm probably oversimplifying their statements, but this is how it seems to me as more or less a layman, is what they seem to want to do is state something about male and female as categories, because they're thinking of them in categories because they're thinking of them really the best way to define male and female as categories is you have to find something in reality that is similarly categorical for all intents and purposes. You have to find something in nature that is either one or the other. Probably the best way to do this is sperm and ova, or and whatever reproductive organ or capacity you want to use, because it makes it easier to actually find that rigid categorical, however you want to do it. That's what they're thinking of, right? They're assuming, they're talking about, okay, you have in order to be in the category male, you have to meet these conditions. And in order to be in the category female, you have to meet these conditions. If you meet these conditions, you are, in terms of this, looking at the concept, you are 100% female or 100% male. You can't be 75% male in a categorical thing any more than you can be 75% the number one. You're either 1 or 0 in a binary code. You can't be in between. It's not a spectrum sort of thing when you're thinking about them in that way. So the problem is that this is not scientific, at least in the way that people, certainly not for psychology, because the way that we usually do scientific measurements is we're always trying to get as accurate as possible, and that means you're thinking in terms of a spectrum. When you're doing an experiment, you're observing all these different cases and you have to distinguish them from each other, meaning you have to have kind of a dimensional scale. Usually scientists feel very uncomfortable when they're like, oh no, you have to put them either in this category or in this category. Because they're like, no, we want to show the variability and the trends and things. So what ends up happening is people, like in this case it's not self-contradictory in itself in the way they state it, because they say women consistently report higher neuroticism. But I just feel, and I think I see people say, and they want to say, that this says something about women as a categorical concept. So what they want to do is to extrapolate from what is ultimately a spectrum form of data to a categorical, or to extrapolate from the majority to say this is how everybody is. And they never admit to this when you bring it up with them, but I feel like that's how they think. Let me describe this a little bit more. So if you're going to, in my mind, a lot of people seem to want the distinction between male and female. People want to involve all these other things in there. They want to involve the kinds of clothes you wear, or the way that you act, or the way that you think, or all these different things. They want those to also be conditions. But it's like, if you involve those as conditions, like take for instance like, in order for them to be categories, in order for you to avoid talking about male and female as being on a spectrum where you can be all the colors of the rainbow in between, which is what a lot of people don't want to happen, well, here's your answer to not have that happen. Stop talking about psychological differences between men and women, at least in the way that you are, because you're just making the problem worse. If your goal ideologically is to say, no more spectrum, you're either male or female, then you need to simplify your definitions, and you need to simplify them down and ground them in something that is a categorical. Psychological differences aren't categorical. There's all this wishy-washy waving. Now, I feel what people will say is that, well, we're testing, we're just trying to observe the men and see how they behave, and the women and see how they behave. And I'm like, okay, well then how are you differentiating who the men are and who the women are? Because that's becoming harder and harder. People are making that harder and harder for us every day. In the Western world, at least. So how are you differentiating the men and the women? And it seems to me, well, okay, you got to get back to some sort of basics, and you have to let go of all these other things that you want to associate with them. I'm not saying that there isn't correlation. I'm just saying if you're going to talk about them as categories, you've got to find and you've got to settle on something that is very basic, And I think probably the best one that I can think of is the sperm-ova difference. And there's the intersex exceptions to that, and there's probably other things I haven't thought of, but you'd need to get down to something like that and literally forget about everything else, because that is the as far that's the natural condition. We are a condition for our existence is the sexual reproduction. It is the fact that a male and a female with the sperm and the ova join and produce a child, and that's a condition for every being's experience. So we should probably remember, and not continually act as though that's not important. Um, it just seems very obvious to me. I'm sure it seems very obvious to lots of other people, but the reason I'm trying to pound this down is because, by all means, absolutely, you will find that once you've differentiated them in that way, okay, cool, now you can study the people who have the ova separately from the people who have the sperm. And you can find, oh, there's this bell curve of there's this clumping of psychological traits that people who have sperm, quite reasonably, seem to clump around certain personality traits, without marginalizing or excluding the people who don't, and confusing the issue so that people think that they're not, that they don't fit into the category and that there's something else. Because in a sense, they are, when you don't define it very rigidly as it's about the sperm. People want male and female, especially male, but I'm sure it's the same with female. I'm more familiar with the male, that they want it to be almost this moral issue where you need to act more like a man. You need to be more masculine. If you're going to talk like that, then you just have to understand that women will be perfectly capable of being that too, until you say that no, there's a cutoff here with the biology, and the biology from birth or something like that, just to make it very rigid and harsh there, and say no, there's a cutoff here. But you see the confusion that ends up here, right? Like, it's something very important to me. It's important to me because growing up, um, uh, you know, it's been interesting. I've grown up and I've watched this transition. Growing up, I watched, from a very young age, the development of computers all the way up to phones and the laptop that I have now, and the development of the internet. I didn't really have the internet when I was younger. Like, definitely not in the way we have now. I didn't really use the internet until I was in middle school or so, that I can remember. It was always this scary place, and excuse me, where you'd get viruses or something, and it was only later when I really started to start using it. And I remember dial-up, and anyway, but also all these social issues. I remember, and so it's like, I remember when I was younger, it feeling very clear that there were these notions of, the best example would be all the way back in kindergarten, and I'm not kidding, I'm not exaggerating, and I've told a lot of people this. I remember in kindergarten, I hated it when they would do boys versus girls. The reason I hated that is because you were shoving me into a group of all these other boys, and okay, fine. It's like, yeah, I'm a boy. I never had any trouble with that, but you're now applying all these labels to me that I don't agree with. Even though I know biologically, I didn't know a lot of details then, but I knew that I was a boy, but I didn't identify that with, certain emotional traits or any traits, really. It just was what I was, and you could tell the difference between the one or the other. And I didn't like being shoved into this other group with all these other boys and it being implied that I was like all of them or that some of them were like others. And more importantly, I didn't like the competition that was being created because I just wanted everybody to get along. And I didn't, and there was even a part I remember, I think, there was even a point where I was thinking to myself, okay, listen, like, how is this going to work when we get older? Because I know I came from a guy and a girl, and I don't know how it worked, but just in my head, I just already kind of had it intuitively known that, okay, eventually we've got to be able to cooperate for this to work. And you're like trying to create this class warfare thing. And I remember all the girls like saying that boys were smelly and stuff, and I resented that, and I I didn't want to resent it because those kinds of things get under your skin, as I'm sure other things have gotten under the skin of a lot of young women, feeling like they've been told that they're this way or that way and such, and it's troublesome, right? Because the most pernicious falsities are things that, when you say them, they're actually true, but they're being used in a way that's pernicious. And what I mean by that is that, and I'm not trying to make political statements here or anything. I'm just trying to be more with everybody. I'm just trying to be more open and honest and not afraid to say certain things that I really do believe. And I, in a sense, that's my show of respect to other people, that I regard you guys and I regard other people in my life as intelligent agents that I want to respect, and I want to respect them. I would hope, by just being honest with my opinions, and as long as I am polite and considerate and trying to listen to opposite viewpoints and all those things that we hear about, um, then that's my sign of respect. And so I'm still kind of overcoming hurdles, but what I'm trying to say is that there are these, in my mind, there's these very basic biological differences, or really difference, just to make things simple. Because once you say differences, you start to get into areas where you're telling people what they can and can't do. And there's, to a certain degree, that is correct. That, I can't get pregnant, you know, and I don't have a problem with that. I mean, there is a certain area where I'm kind of like, well, not that I want to get pregnant, but I feel bad almost for all these women who will get pregnant. And I also don't like the fact that I feel like they have a card they can pull. Well, I'm going to have to give birth and you won't. And I'm like, but that's a whole separate issue. I think I'm getting over that or something. I remember that really bothered me as a kid. Uh, but if you're going to talk, so if you're going to, that's why I want to emphasize this, because whenever I'm talking about the masculine and feminine, I'm talking about them as principles, and I'm talking about them as something that is separate from the biology that people have, and that you have these principles that intermix in individuals. But you also have this biological reality that is the condition for us existing. And I guess I'm kind of tiptoeing around the issue. I'm not going to get into certain things here. I don't think that's appropriate right now, because everybody's cashing in their opinions. I have, I have a couple of very good friends, and they're wonderful people, and I respect them a lot, and I want to always respect them, who have transitioned and are transgender, and I know that they know that our views differ on certain things, but and I'm saying this because I don't know if they're watching, and they know perfectly well that they can come to me and talk to me face to face, and I would hope that I'd have the courage and respect to be to be open with them, and I've tried to be before. So I'm just debating whether or not I'm going to actually put this up, if I'm brash enough to do that. I wonder if as a community where it's almost like I'm in a relationship with the community where I'm like, I wonder if we're at that stage in our relationship after all these years where I can post my thoughts on this. Um, but I sort of lost my train of thought. I think what I was trying to say is I'm just trying to figure things out. But I think all I really wanted to say was I want to make it clear that I want this difference between um, when I talk about the masculine and feminine. I don't want that to get intermixed with what I'm saying about individuals, um, because growing up, I would be bothered by people trying to imply that I was innately a certain way. Um, it is absolutely fair game to say it's very likely I'm a certain way or that I am a certain way, but when you say I am a certain way because I am a man, it gets confusing because you're not explaining to me what you're not showing me the connection here, and you're also not showing me how you define man, because I feel like we're not very clear as a society on what we mean when we say that. I think you need to be very clear with, okay, we're talking about this biological difference that is directly tied to reproduction, and that's why it's important, and everything else is really kind of auxiliary and accidental to that. And that way you can have women who are very masculine in the masculine term, but they're still women at the same time, and then you can differentiate properly between these things. Um, so I just wanted to make that clear because it's something that's important to me, and I'm very bothered with how people have been talking about these things as though the masculine and feminine were, as though all women were perfect embodiments of the feminine as a principle, and none of the masculine were there. And more importantly, that they should be perfect embodiments of the feminine as a principle. And if they're not, the implication being that it's somehow wrong for a woman, a biological woman, to take on elements of the masculine, of the assertiveness and stuff. And because I'm very big, just so that we don't have more misunderstandings, I, I'm very big on the family. It seems, very clear to me that family is, that's where I came from. And just looking out at the world in many, many cases, certainly not all, because this isn't, I'm not making a categorical distinction, I'm just making a spectrum comparison. And so it's perfectly clear because there are amazing individuals who have grown up without families, for all intents and purposes. Obviously not literally because they came from somewhere, but there's people who grew up in orphanages, but they always had figures who stepped in to try to fill certain roles, and it was different people at different times and so forth. But that being as it is, there is still an obvious clumping, even just in my own experience, where I've been incredibly blessed with just an amazing family that. And I hope that I would be able to spread the benefits I feel that I've reaped from that with other people, and that would be my sort of gift back for my good fortune, as it were. Because I know that it's becoming more and more that there's more and more people who are in homes that are not good soil to grow in, and so my point being that. I wasn't planning on getting into this, but I guess I might as well because it's something it seems very clear to me that I think that most generations up to this point have taken it for granted that, human beings are supposed to have families and reproduce. And for instance, there was a point where Jordan Peterson was asked, he was referring to, he had some client or something, and I don't remember where this was, but he had a client who said to him, it's something you hear more and more these days: I don't want to bring up children in this awful world. I don't want to have kids in this awful world. And Jordan Peterson, which is his response, was very similar to a lot of older people's responses that I've seen, where he became rather upset, was sort of like, what are you talking about? But he didn't actually address the problem. He mainly talked about some very interesting and I think ennobling points about how, this is, the world has never been, it's never been a good place to bring up children. The world is awful and you've got to bear it up under your back and all these things. But he's not addressing the core issue, which is the nihilistic thought that why are we still continuing this whole project? Uh, why do we keep having children? And he never answered that question. At least he didn't seem to make the link. I think he does have answers to that question if he could face it, but he wasn't making a clear link, or realizing that that's really what she was expressing, was at bottom a very deeply nihilistic feeling of, why are we still doing this? I actually wrote a science fiction story. I was never able to get it published, but where it was just very simple, like 3-page story where a group of people are migrating to another planet, and they contact this planet beforehand because a bunch of other people went to the planet before them to sort of colonize it, and so they're heading there, and they sent out a message, and the planet basically said, yeah, we've determined philosophically that there's no real reason, like, we're already born, so, and we think we can make the best of this world, it's an awful place, and everybody suffers, and we're all going to die and all that stuff, and, there's sorrow and stuff, but we don't feel like, there's any need for us to commit suicide. We can make the best of it, but we don't feel that there is enough ethical justification for us to make anybody else go through this. You see what I'm saying? If it's true that we're creating more life ex nihilo, like out of nothing, what gives us the right to do that, right? Like, if I give birth to somebody, and this is another sentiment people have said, if I give birth to somebody and they grow up and they just have a hard time of it and end up doing horrible things and end up miserable and making other people miserable, okay, well, maybe they could have been Beethoven, but they didn't become Beethoven, right? And so that's a central nihilistic problem. And so this planet was basically just like, we don't see why we should be continuing this. If anything, just simply because what gives us the right to